Welcome to Inspire Change, a new inspirational and motivational broadcast that strives to empower men in a positive way, designed to educate, empower, and inspire even the busiest individual on the go over that first cup of coffee. Please join me in welcoming Gunter, international psychologist, author, speaker, and producer.
Welcome back, everybody. This is Inspire Change with Gunter. So I'm going to pick up from the last podcast, which was essentially about stopping domestic violence and how that aspect actually requires us as men to step up and step into solving that particular problem. And I don't believe that we're going to get it right 100% of the time, but I think as men, it really has become our business. We men need to step up. Now, I started that particular podcast off with a link between bullying and ultimately domestic violence. And I see this as a continuum. And so what I want to do today is I want to focus on the bullying aspect, because when most of us think about bullying, we think about stuff at school, what happens in the playground. And although that's true, we actually have a broader landscape in which this occurs. So let's talk a little bit about the definition of bullying. What is bullying? I get a lot of people who think that bullying is, a quick push and shove and then the kids go their separate ways and there's no further problem. But we really need to be very much clearer about that definition. And so the general consensus is that bullying is an ongoing, in other words, repeated verbal, physical and or social behaviour that causes physical, social and psychological harm. Now, generally speaking, we're talking about individuals, one-on-one. But I've got to stress the fact that groups also misuse their power or their perceived power over one or more people. Now, the other aspect that's relatively new is that once upon a time, bullying happened in the real world. More recently, however, we have online bullying, often referred to as cyberbullying, where lots of different digital platforms and devices can be used to bully somebody. So let me talk a little bit about what bullying is not, so that we're very, very clear. Bullying is not single episodes of social rejection or dislike. So, yeah, you can go, I don't like Freddie, Johnny, Mary, whatever. It's also not single episodes of an act of nastiness or spite, nor is bullying a random act of aggression or intimidation, nor is it mutual arguments, disagreements, or fights. Although these actions can cause distress, they don't fit the definition of bullying. And they're not examples of bullying unless someone is deliberately and repeatedly doing them. Now, let me come back to something that's really, really important in understanding bullying, especially bullying amongst children. And I'll extrapolate that a little bit further when I talk about bullying amongst adults. One of the issues is that it's someone or a group of people misusing their power. Now, in the framework of Making Good Men Great, we talk about hierarchies and status. And so one of the things that is really, really important is to understand how these dynamics work, especially amongst kids at school. Now, it may not be such a problem within the primary school system, but at high school, it becomes significant. One of the reasons is that in high school, adolescents begin to individuate. They start to develop and function in a way that wants them to be part of a group, but it also wants them to be individuals. Now, if being an individual is too different from the group norm, then that can also create some serious issues. and that is that the group will try to get the individual to conform to the group norms. That can have all sorts of negative ramifications, including aggressive and violent acting out. And I'll talk about this a little bit further down the track. But right now, I want everyone to understand that the whole thing about being part of a tribe and having hierarchies in that tribe can lend itself very easily to exercising power over someone else. Let me illustrate that by going back to one of the stories that I used in the previous podcast, and that was a young boy who was an Aboriginal boy, and he suffered from dwarfism, and essentially he was being bullied. And there's probably two levels where he could have been targeted, although I don't know that, but I would imagine that that could have been an issue. Is one, he's Aboriginal, he's the first. One of the first peoples, and secondly, he suffers from dwarfism, a disability, and in that context, he's vulnerable. And unless we educate kids from a very, very early age on that that's not appropriate, we're going to continue to have this problem. That young boy was simply different on two different levels. Not something that goes down well in a society where we like to see more of the same rather than differences. And I'm quite strong on this. So let's talk a little bit about the types of bullying. Certainly my work with teenagers and also in the corporate world has given me a really, really good insight in how people have bullied others. So the obvious one that we tend to see is verbal bullying. Verbal bullying includes name-calling, insults, intimidation, teasing, homophobia, racist remarks, and anything that isn't part of the norm. So one of the things that I saw a lot in girls' schools was body image stuff. The group would often tease someone repeatedly for their height, size, weight, the clothes that they wore, the shoes that they had. So it was a lot about appearance. There was a lot of pressure to conform. Color of your hair. You know, in certain peer groups, having red hair, for example, was a serious, serious problem. There are two types of bullying which are particularly insidious these days. And so let me talk about social bullying. This is the one that I frequently run across now, where often people miss the definition. Now, what they're seeing is actual bullying. People often refer to it as covert bullying, and it's difficult to recognize, and because it's actually sort of done in stealth mode. It's designed to harm someone's social reputation, position. It's there really to humiliate someone. Now, social bullying can often include things like negative facial or physical gestures, menacing or contemptuous looks, playing nasty jokes to embarrass or humiliate them, encouraging others to socially exclude someone. A term that's recently been bandied about amongst the boys that I use is about being ghosted. Damaging someone's social reputation or social acceptance is another way of doing it. The one that's particularly problematic is when someone begins a process of lying and spreading rumors about an individual, or sometimes it's about a little group. So these things are often, as I said, difficult to spot, and they're very, very difficult to try and control and really bring to the surface and deal with effectively. Embedded in social bullying is the whole issue about cyberbullying, wherein what we're talking about is an intentional repeated harm inflicted through the use of computers, phones, and other electronic devices. When I was a kid, if anyone got bullied, usually after school, that bullying would stop because you would leave the school, you would go home, and you'd either go out and play with your friends, or you'd spend time alone at home. And the kids who were bullying you at school didn't have any access to you after school. They only had access to you at school. With the advent of smartphones, that whole scenario changed dramatically. What we started to see very, very quickly was the use of digital technologies as a medium to pursue. And in a lot of cases, it was like stalking. Unless you had your phone off, there was constantly, and still is, constantly stuff appearing on your phone that's there to harass, intimidate, bully the owner of that particular device. And I see that within that is a serious, serious, serious problem. The inability to get away from someone who's essentially stalking you, intimidating you, humiliating you, and it's persistent. Now, it's all very well to say, well, just turn your phone off. For kids in a peer group where most of their social contact revolves around being included through social media and through the digital device, that becomes really hard because you're going to start to feel left out. You're going to start to feel ostracized, which is often what the bully actually wants to achieve. So therein we have some serious, serious issues, but very clear definitions if we want to really take them up. So in my definition of bullying and harassment, these behaviours, these types of bullying are in fact forms of violence. And so we need to go, well, if this is what's happening amongst kids and teenagers, what happens in adulthood? Now, obviously, most of us know that bullying and harassment doesn't go away in adulthood. In fact, quite frequently, we find ourselves in a workplace where there may be a culture of this, or there may be one person who's recognised in the organisation as being the bully, and you happen to be working around that person. And so here we've got a situation where obviously a lot of people feel that their job's dependent on them being able to put up with whatever it is that that person in power dishes out. And it is exceptionally difficult to get people to begin to be assertive and to lay down some boundaries. Now, obviously, in an adult world, it is very, very rare to see anybody physically bully someone. However, emotional and verbal bullying and social bullying is very much a part of the picture. And it takes often people a while to understand what they're immersed in. It's a bit like coming into an emotionally toxic relationship. In the beginning, everything seems sort of to be quite subtle. It's often difficult to go, is that person really bullying me or not? What's going on between the two of us? Because generally what happens is that it becomes more and more and more and more severe as time goes by. One of the reasons for that is that it's very rare for anyone in the beginning to be very clear about laying down social expectations about the relationship. And this is one of the things that's critical. We need to be comfortable and confident enough in our relationships to be able to say to someone, even if they are in power, I am not comfortable with your behavior towards me. People often say to me, but if I say that, it's just going to get worse. Well, in an adult world, that may be the case. However, there are steps that you can take that will bring the issue to a head. Now, sometimes, unfortunately, as a lot of people have experienced, that doesn't necessarily end up in a nice way. Some bullies are very, very socially powerful, especially in professions where it's sort of part of the culture that you just got to put up with it. Toughen up, you'll be right. And guess what? Eventually you might even be partnership material. So one of the questions that has often arisen in my sessions with people, whether I'm working with teenagers or whether I'm coaching executives, is why do people bully other people? Now, there's obviously a number of variables that come into play. With the school bully, my experience is usually that that particular individual is uncomfortable in their own skin. They're actually often scared little boys who have worked out that if they intimidate somebody else, then they can feel more powerful, they can feel more secure. Unfortunately, it doesn't go so well for the person that they're targeting. Sometimes that behavior just simply carries on into adulthood. So people just go from high school into the workplace and they continue with that behavior because it's been intrinsically rewarded throughout their life. They've found that they can get what they want or they can feel more powerful when they bully. There is another type of person who bullies, and that is the person who believes that they have a sense of entitlement to be more powerful than others. So in the corporate world, we often talk about white privileged males. And there's certainly some truth, because our system, as I talk about, is about being patriarchal, and that in that context, if you are territorial, hierarchical, acquisitional, and competitive, you are going to get some rewards, but that comes at the cost of somebody else, more often than not. So we need to help people to reflect and understand that ultimately that behavior isn't going to pay off, and that's why all of us need to stand up and be counted when it comes to things like physical, verbal, emotional, and social violence. You know, I sometimes think that using the term bullying and harassment is a watered down version of basically saying these people are being violent in a relationship. Because the reason why I can link it to violence is because of the harm it leaves the other person feeling. Or even in groups, it's very easy to intimidate someone in that context. Okay, so the message, the takeout for today is recognize the behaviors. Understand what bullying and harassment is, and help, if it's children, to get them to understand the harm that they can cause by behaving that way. And like with all violence, my argument is that as an adult, I need to have zero tolerance with children in that regard. They need to be made aware of it, and they need to be able to experience consequences around that behavior. In the adult world, if I'm experiencing something that I'm not comfortable with, I need to speak out. Suffering in silence will mean that I'm just going to suffer more. This is about continuing to have a voice. And that voice is not just about sexual abuse. It's not just about, violence, physical violence. It's about the emotional toxicity at times that we're exposed to. And we need to really bring that to the broader attention of whether that's human resources or whether that is to the person themselves. And I like to start off with basically saying to the person who's behaving badly, please, I understand what you're doing and I want you to stop. If you don't stop this, I'm going to take it further. As in domestic violence, we know that men who have to face legal consequences after the first time they strike out physically, they have a tendency not to repeat that behavior as frequently as often as men who can get away with it time and time again. They will just escalate. So we need to have some social pressure, in a sense, to manage that behavior. So if you're not assertive, take it from me. Learn how to be assertive. And that goes for children, teenagers, men, and women. All of us are at risk of experiencing some form of emotional, social, or physical abuse sometime in our life. I hope that was useful. Till next time.
Thank you, Gunter, and thank you to our listeners. Inspire Change with Gunter Swoboda. Please join us every Wednesday for a new broadcast by visiting www.spreaker.com/show/inspire-change, which will feature all the ways you can listen. If you have comments or suggestions, email producer@studio3hollywood.net. Thank you and have an inspiring day.